Okay, good afternoon. This is Pat O'Connell. I'm calling to order a special open meeting on section 62-18-10D of the Energy Transition Act. It's Wednesday, October 11th at 1 o'clock. So having called it to order, I'll call the roll. Commissioner Aguilera.
Present.
Commissioner Ellison.
Present.
I'm here, so we have quorum and 3 commissioners. We have a fairly simple agenda in front of us today, but commissioners, do you have any changes you'd like to make to the agenda?
I do not. None for me.
Okay, seeing concurrence on the agenda, we'll proceed with the agenda as posted. I'd like to put public comment early in the meeting, but I'll go ahead and just kind of frame up what's going to happen, and then we'll do public comment. This is a step in a rulemaking process, and this commission has had success with these informal workshops. And this is an interesting rule because, as Art will explain, it's a section of the law that pretty much applies just to one utility. So just wanted to have an informal workshop to get information on the table. Today, for me anyway, is all about listening. Next step will be issuing a notice of proposed rulemaking, where we'll collect what we've heard today and put together a proposal or some choices, and then there'll be another more formal round of rulemaking after that. So that's what we have teed up for today. And then, having said that, I'll turn it over to Patrick. Do you know if has anybody registered for public comment? I mean, there's a couple of parties, like Stephanie Zur is here in person. We'd heard that Western Resource Advocates had stuff to say. My thought was, we'll go for the folks who have participated before today. We'll go ahead and hear from Arthur and then have a discussion among PNM, Stephanie, WRA. So is there anybody that is outside of that group that also wants to make public comment? And then again, this is super informal. So if you give public comment now, we're not going to say you can't speak later. But so having said that, Patrick, do we have anybody who's registered for public comment on this?
Mr. Chair, we do not have anyone registered.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, I think I've already given my introductory remarks. Is there anything either commissioner would like to say? No comments? All right. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. O'Donnell. He's put together a slide presentation to frame up why we're here and what it is that we're looking at. And then I think he has some summaries on some of the comments that we've received so far. So anyway, the thought is that will be a good foundation for a discussion to follow.
Thank you.
Take it away, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, commissioners, ladies and gentlemen. Patrick, we do have slides if you could put them up. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. This is just background information. There's really nothing new in what I'll be talking about. We just want to kind of bring together kind of the background and to help establish the record for this proceeding, because hopefully we will be moving towards a rulemaking under this docket 23-00294. We're talking about compliance with one particular section of the Energy Transition Act. As you all know, the goals that were established in the ETA are generally about increasing the number of the renewable energy portfolio requirements through the year 2045. But there are 2 places in the ETA that specifically set out what we would call a greenhouse gas emissions limit or a production limit. One of them is section 10, which is what we're talking about today, which is specific to PNM's closure of coal-fired generation. The other section 36B actually it relates to activities by the New Mexico Environmental Improvement Board to establish a more of a portfolio standard for the utilities that meet certain criteria. We won't be talking about that today, but we probably will be talking about that in the future. I won't read, next slide, please. I won't read this whole thing, but basically it says that under this provision, section 10, there will be a carbon limit of 400 pounds per megawatt hour by January 1st, 2023, and a 2032 limit of 200 pounds per megawatt hour. Compliance shall be measured and verified every 3 years, with the first period commencing January 1st, 2023. And the commission shall adopt rules to implement the requirements of this subsection. Obviously, here we are in October, and we're doing a little bit of a catch up. I want to commend PNM for reaching out to the commission on a number of occasions, asking us when we're going to pick this up, and now we're here. So thank you. As previously described in the initial order opening this docket, it really turns out that implementation of that section, while it seems to be clear, is not so cut and dry. PNM has received a financing order related to the abandonment of the last 2 units of the San Juan generating station, but the utility has not yet completed the process of issuing securitization, i.e. the bonds to pay down the stranded investments in SJGS and to fund economic development in the affected communities. In early August, PRC advisory and utility division staff met with PNM executives to review the status and utility proposals for how to comply with Section 10D. Next slide, please. This is the formula that PNM has proposed, and there will be some discussion about that. But basically, it comes down to taking the entire generation as the denominator, which is what is serving retail load plus off-system sales in terms of megawatt hours, and that divides into the total CO2 emissions that are documented for that period. According to PNM, in the first 6 months of this year, they're not quite there in terms of reaching the goal. Their calculation under this formula shows 524 pounds per megawatt hour. And I'll just state that that is about half of what it was 2 years ago. So progress is being made. The question is, how do we bring PNM into compliance with the actual terms of the act, right? PNM has identified that it would like to see compliance measured every 3 years. So we have a 3-year period in which emissions could be averaged in order to help meet it. We'll show what that means. But the act also states that the qualified utility shall not emit, right? It's one of those shalls, more than 400 pounds per megawatt hour by January 1st. So we have that problem, which is obviously we're not quite in compliance yet. And so our goal here is to find a way to reaching compliance. A major consideration for achieving compliance will be the timing of eventual abandonment of the PNM share of the Four Corners power plant. Next slide. I'm sorry for the small type on this, but this is what PNM presented to us in terms of their estimations. And
hold on, Art, you're talking on slide
7, yes.
There we go.
Okay. That they've estimated where they are, and really their ability to comply in a first 3-year period really depends on whether and when Four Corners will be off of their books. So what we see here is that with Four Corners still, the utility has quite a ways to go, all right? And it wouldn't be until after 2025 that they would achieve the level that's specified in the act. If Four Corners is taken off the books, then while it's still in 2025, there's a significant difference in what their projection for emissions profile will be. So that's one of the major considerations that the commission has to take into effect. We did ask for more detailed information and a range of questions to the order, and the questions will be the basis for our discussion today. When should the 400 pounds per megawatt hour CO2 emissions limit be considered in effect? Whether the 400 pounds per megawatt hour CO2 emissions limit is an instantaneous limit, or should it be averaged over some specific duration? We want to know kind of better ideas for the formula for calculating the carbon intensity in order to establish compliance. We asked about the schedule for demonstrating ongoing compliance with Section 10D. We did ask for estimates of compliance using a quarterly reporting basis extended for at least 1 year. We didn't really get much information about that. It was a little hard to project for the parties. We did ask about, well, what do we do if the utility is not in compliance, right? Or if it continues to not be in compliance, should be there's some recourse for that, and how the commission should think about that and build that into the rule. And finally, it's a little bit of an appendix to this issue, but PNM in its 2021 IRP had essentially pledged allegiance to meeting this standard and has not filed a variance in the IRP. And so it's strongly suggested that we would like to see PNM file a variance that brings us up to date. We know the PNM has been providing the commission with monthly reports about its resource portfolio under the docket that was investigating resource adequacy for the past 2 summers. Those reports continue and are essentially the same information that the utility could use in requesting a variance from the 2021 IRP. We are also in the process of developing the 2024 IRP, but this is really kind of like just a little thing that I think could be easily resolved. The responses to the questions that were posed were received from PNM, the utility division staff, and attorney Stephanie Jure. Western Resource Advocates also contacted the commission about providing comments, and hopefully they're here today to help participate in the discussion. These positions and statements will be considered in the discussion that follows and in the rulemaking that the commission hopes to take up very soon in order to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking and kind of really deal with this issue of compliance. That's all I have, commissioners, unless there's any questions.
Yeah, thank you. Does anybody have questions for Arthur on that?
I don't think so. Not right now.
I yield my seat.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so next on the agenda is discussion. So who I see in attendance with us right now is PNM and Stephanie Zur. Totally open to how we want to structure this discussion. One thought is if there's something you want to say about just broadly where we're at, go ahead and make an opening statement. Another thought is I could walk through this set of questions that we asked and try to provide more context around why I was asking those questions. Again, the goal today is just to try to get a good base of information so that we can do an OPR. So the other fruitful area I see maybe of discussion is hopefully you saw each other's comments and maybe have questions for each other or want to respond to anything. So anyway, it's pretty open. And I see WRA in the house. So on the Zoom, Stacy Tellingwiesen from Western Resource Advocates just joined us. So I don't know, Stacy, if you had the opportunity to listen up to now, but we're at the discussion moment and still trying to make sure everybody has an opportunity to be heard. But then with a open source approach to how that's going to happen. So anyway, I posed questions to Ms. Zur and PNM just for suggestions on how they'd like to proceed. The concept I threw out there is go ahead and make an opening statement, or I can walk through these questions that were asked just to provide some context and see if you have things you want to emphasize in what you supplied, or you have questions for each other. That's all fair. So anyway, I realize this is kind of spur of the moment, but Yes.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners,
Yes, Ms. Beatles.
Sydney Beatles, Western Resource Advocates. Stacy has prepared a few slides, 6, well, not including the cover and last 5 slides. And I don't know if it would be useful to the commission to hear from WRA now, or whether you want to hear from us later.
Well, has everybody seen the WRA slides?
I have no.
Okay, so I think it'd be valuable to go ahead and if you want to walk through those, because we do have written responses from PNM, from Utility Division staff, and from Stephanie Zur. Does anybody object to doing it that way? No, okay. So then, Patrick, if you could give control to either Sydney or Stacy, and they can post the slides, share screen with the slides.
Mr. Chair, Commission, we provided those slides to McLee late yesterday afternoon.
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, I can share that.
Okay, great. That's better.
And thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. This is Stacy Tellingson with Western Resource Advocates. I'll walk through our few slides and kind of our initial thinking on how to implement this section of the Energy Transition Act. And apologies for not submitting written comments in advance, but we'll follow up after this workshop with additional written comments. Next slide, please. As we sort of review the Energy Transition Act and think about the overarching goal of this section of the Act, the way we read it is the goal is to ensure that energy that's serving PNM's retail customers meets these emission rate standards. And so that's kind of the framing that we've gone into this with. And I want to highlight kind of 4 key principles that we would recommend the Commission consider as it develops regulations to implement this portion of the Act. I think the first key principle is a basic one, but capture emissions associated with energy serving retail customers in the numerator and sales to retail customers in the denominator. And I think this is the piece that's sort of most in debate at this point in time to, how are those actually quantified? And I'll dive more into that in my following slides. I think the second key principle that I want to emphasize is to ensure robust accounting of renewable energy and all of its environmental attributes. And I think this is critical because if PNM is counting renewable energy as a zero carbon resource, it's critical that PNM retires the renewable energy credit associated with that renewable in the year generated. If that REC is not retired, but is instead sold off to another entity, it means that another entity is counting that renewable energy and its zero emission attribute to meet some other compliance, and that is essentially double counting. So I think that's a critical component. As we think about how to implement this standard, I think one key feature is ensuring that there's really robust utility reporting to guard against non-compliance so that we don't get to the end of a compliance period and realize that we've missed the target. And then the fourth principle that I would emphasize is that we think that as the Commission designs penalties, those penalties should really be designed in a way to achieve the emission reduction goals of the statute. And I'll provide a little more detail to that in a moment. Next slide. So again, as I said, I think the trickiest part of this is how you decide what the emissions or how you calculate this emission rate. And I think as we think about it, as I read the statute is really about emissions associated with retail sales. And so we have structured kind of a calculation methodology that we think ensures that we're calculating the emission rate associated with retail sales. And so it's, at its most basic level, it's emissions associated with New Mexico dedicated generation divided by retail sales. And I think WRA would recommend that emissions, total emissions and total retail sales are measured over a 3-year period. So that does allow for averaging over that 3-year period. But that, again, there's robust annual reporting of emissions and retail sales to ensure that that we don't get to the end of that 3-year period and miss the target. Next slide, please. And sorry, there's a few pieces, so go ahead and click through till we see number 4. So apologies, there's a lot of words on this slide, but I'll walk through it all. I think the question is, what are the emissions that are counted and captured in this emission rate standard? And we've proposed one approach here that, again, captures emissions associated with generation serving PNM's retail customers. So first is to identify what is the suite of dedicated generation. And I think there's 4 components of that. First is capacity that's assigned to the utility for rate-making purposes, so owned resources, essentially. The second is PPAs that are at least 24 months in duration. But then those are reduced by any portion of that capacity that is sold off to another entity through a long-term contract. And then the 4th portion of dedicated generation is long-term market purchases. And I'll talk a little bit more about this momentarily, but I think as we look at it, since the ETA was passed, the energy world is changing, and I think there's more movement towards wholesale energy markets or day-ahead markets. Any of those markets, if PNM chose to enter them, would be a commitment, I think, for at least 24 months. And so I think emissions associated with any purchases from a wholesale market should count as dedicated generation and should be included in this emission rate standard. I think it's critical that as the commission designs this rule, it's designed in a way that that is flexible, so that if the world changes over the next decade and PNM is part of either a day ahead or a wholesale market, the commission is still able to ensure that the energy serving PNM's retail customers achieves these emission standards. So that was first, again, identify the dedicated generation. The second is adjusting the emissions from dedicated generation for any off-system sales. And this is really just the calculation to make sure that we're only counting emissions associated with PNM's retail sales. And so under our proposal, we would attribute 100% of renewable energy to the utility, again, if the utility is retiring the RECs. And then for the remaining load on the system, we would apply the system average emission rate for non-renewable generation. And this is just to ensure that the utility is not saying, well, this more carbon intensive resource is actually being sold off through off-system sales, and these cleaner resources are serving our retail customers. It's to ensure that there's not resource shuffling, essentially. And so again, it's just applying the average emission rate associated with fossil resources and nuclear resources to that remaining load. The third piece of this calculation methodology is just ensuring that renewable energy that's counted, that the RECs are retired associated with that renewable energy, again, to prevent any potential double counting. And then the 4th piece is to include emissions from any wholesale market participation. And again, that is in the future if PNM were part of a wholesale market. And I'll touch more on the wholesale market participation issue in the next slide, which we can go to now. And you can click through till you see number 3. Thank you. Sorry for keep having these animated. Again, as we think about it, we think that any participation in an organized market would require a commitment of greater than 24 months, and so should be included as part of the dedicated generation. I think if it were not included as part of the dedicated generation, there is a risk that the commission would not be able to ensure that the energy serving retail customers meets this emission standard. And so to calculate emissions from market power purchases, we would recommend that the commission just looks at the annual market power emission rate times the total annual market purchases. And we have a few bullets here on how to look at that market power emission rate, or how to estimate, calculate it. So the market power emission rate could simply be the emission rate associated with all generators in the market if the utility is acquiring and retiring all the RECs and the environmental attributes from that energy. I think in reality, more likely the emission rate associated with market purchases should reflect the fossil and nuclear generators in the market, reflecting the fact that, for most market participants or utilities that are selling energy into the market, most are retaining those RECs. And so most RECs for renewable energy in a market are already spoken for. And then the third key tenet of this piece, I think, is just making sure that the emissions data is the most specific data available. So that may be data that's reported by the market itself. If that's not available, then it may be EPA eGrid data for the particular NERC subregion. So that could be for SPP or for WEC or for the Arizona, New Mexico subregion, for example. And that data is published every other year. Next slide. So that's kind of the bulk of our thinking on the calculation methodology. I just wanted to highlight our thinking on a couple of the other key principles, which were questions that the commission raised. The first is we think that reporting progress annually is really critical, and the commission may wish to come up with a list of elements that are reported annually. I think at a minimum, it should include the emission rate for the preceding year, a forecast emission rate for the upcoming year and for the full 3-year period, and then any resources the utility expects to acquire or retire in order to comply with the standard. There's probably other data elements as well that we haven't thought of yet, but those were sort of the top priorities in our mind. And then, as I said at the outset, I think the commission should think about how to design penalties for non-compliance that ensure the utility comes into compliance with the standard or exceeds the standard. And so if a utility does not comply with the emission limit over a 3-year period, we would recommend that the utility has to achieve a higher level of cumulative emissions over the 6-year period. So over the first 3-year period and the second 3-year period. And, I put one suggestion in the slide here. You could suggest that the utility or require that the utility achieve 110% of the emission reductions that it would otherwise achieve over that 6-year period if it had been in compliance. And this is just because really, the issue that we're trying to achieve here, or what we're trying to achieve, is reducing emissions, and cumulative emissions matter. And so we want to make sure that we're at least achieving the same level of cumulative emissions over multiple compliance periods that we would achieve otherwise would have achieved if the utility had been in compliance. And you can go to the next slide. That's the sum of our comments. Again, we're happy to follow up and put all of this into writing for the commission too, but just want to say thank you and appreciate the commission's work and expertise and looking into these important accounting issues. Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, Commissioners, I have one follow-up thought. And if you look at the phrase in the statute, dedicated to serve the qualifying utilities retail customers, I believe that some of the terms and the use of that particular language in that context is subject to some interpretation. And in my opinion, the commission has the authority and the discretion to interpret that in the way that they think is best in the best public interest. And before, and as the commission decides how to proceed, you might want to ask PNM for illustrative purposes to look at the different methodologies that PNM set forth in its comments and ask it to perform the calculations using recent historical data so you can see what the differences in the applications of those different methodologies would be. So that's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for participating today. I've got some questions based on what I just heard. Just wondering, would like to let Ms. Zur and PNM and staff if you've got something you'd like to say, or we could start asking each other questions or. I mean, you provided in writing your answers to the questions as well as asking if you have something you'd like to say.
I can bring you the mic or.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know. If
Or either way.
Or you can come sit at the table.
I'll sit there.
at the table.
Sure.
I wasn't, excuse me,
Yeah, and just so people in Zoom land can hear, you have to push the button to make it green.
Chairman O'Connell, Commissioners Aguilera.
You can press the. There you go.
Thank you.
My mic. Thank you very much for having this workshop and for allowing all to participate for an opportunity. And before we get into the substance, I just want to kind of frame what we're doing here today by pointing out that in 2015, there was a lawsuit by some environmentalists suing Susana Martinez over Article 21 of the New Mexico Constitution. And basically, the significance of that is in that case, the Supreme Court held that the provision, and I'm going to just go ahead and read it. It's let's see, section 20, section 21 of the New Mexico Constitution, Article 20, section 21. It states the protection of the state's beautiful and healthful environment is hereby declared to be of fundamental importance to the public interest, health, safety, and general welfare. The legislature shall provide for control of pollution and control of despoilment of the air, water, and other natural resources of the state, consistent with the use and development of these resources for the maximum benefit of the people. Well, the significance of this case was that the Supreme Court held that the constitutional right to protection of the environment included the atmosphere. It also held that the plaintiffs had inappropriately sued the governor, creating a separation of powers issue. And the correct procedure is to go to the legislature, have the legislature enact laws, and then delegate to the agencies, to the PRC, the authority to carry out those actions. So in sum, the significance here is we do have a constitutional amendment that includes the protection of the atmosphere. And when the legislature has acted to create legislation and delegated the authority to the PRC to carry out these duties, then your duty is a carrying out of a constitutional function and a constitutional requirement. So I just wanted to frame that up for you. And then the next thing I want to get into is the legislation and the requirement that it be implemented on January. I'm looking at my notes, but I'm just going to put that aside because I can't find things as fast as I want to talk about them. So let's just try to wing it here. The legislation provides for a date, but as we know, a lot of things have happened that have kind of made it difficult to be on track here. And one of them is just the delay in bond issuance and everybody's questions about whether they'd be issued, whether PNM had the authority to. That's all behind us now, fortunately. But then the other thing is, I will note, and I didn't mention this in my comments, the law says the commission has to implement this law. And it is, there's something called self-implementing constitutional provisions, and others require the actions of an agency or administrator to put them into effect. And it seems from the language that this is one of them, where the commission has got to implement rules and regulations so the utility knows what it has to do. And so what I want to say is, my comments seem to come down a little bit on PNM and their position that there should be delays. And I had mentioned that there's no excuse. The law is the law. January 1st of 2023 is the date when this starts. And insofar there are conditions, there's conditions precedent, conditions subsequent. I agree, issuance of energy transition bonds is a condition, but it's not a condition precedent. We know it's happening. We know, and PNM has known, that January 1st, 2023 is when this is going to go into effect. But we also have a problem because there's been a delay in implementing the procedures, and we all need to acknowledge that that has happened and figure out a way to all work together to get this back on track. So that's kind of my introductory comments, just acknowledging there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of reasons, and we should not be in a position of pointing fingers and casting blame. Just figure out how can we get this going, get this off the ground, and meet the goal of compliance in 3 years after that first 3-year period. All right, so second, I do thank WRA for their comments. I was really hoping someone would be here to talk about measuring emissions and calculations. I literally, when I made my list of whether or not to go to law school, one of the benefits was I'll never have to do math again. At least that was my hope. And here you are asking for calculations. And so in my calculation, I just want to, if I wasn't very good at articulating what I intended, I just want to be sure that all the megawatts hours for which we're talking about emissions, that number should match the bottom number. So in other words, we would never just have RECs, it has to, whatever the energy, the number of megawatts on the top that are causing the emissions should equal the bottom number. Does that make sense? I hope so. And when I refer to total energy generated in megawatt hours in my calculation, I'm referring again to the generating resources in 2-year or longer PPAs. And now I would like to differ from WRA and PNM actually on the meaning of the statute. And what does it mean? Does it refer to retail sales? Do we care about off-system sales? That's the issue I'd like to address. So I'm going to go directly to the language of the ETA, and I'm in section D, that's 62.18.10D. And I would point out the language here is the qualifying utilities generation and sources of energy procured pursuant to power purchase agreements with a term of 24 months or longer, and that are dedicated to serving the qualifying utilities retail customers. In my opinion, I think that's very specific when it uses power purchase agreements with a term of 24 months of longer. That is a term of art. In fact, it's also a term defined in the commission's rules. And because of that, I think the statute was written with reference to that understanding. We are talking about power purchase agreements of 24 months or longer, and the utilities generation sources. I believe the limitation applies directly without regard to whether it serves retail sales or off-system sales or any of that. And here's why. If you look at the renewable portfolio standard, the language there specifically says retail sales. The utility shall ensure that 20% of retail sales are from renewables in whatever year, and then 40%. It's always retail sales. If the legislature wanted this limitation to apply to retail sales, they knew how to do that, and they did that in the RPS. Here, they said the qualifying utilities generation, all their plants and their sources of energy procured to 24 or longer PPAs. That's very specific.
Could you give a reference for that again?
For the RPS?
The statute, the 24 months.
It is
power purchase.
section D of 62.18.10.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think I've covered that issue. That's my opinion, that we are actually regulating the resources per se. Now, the question then is, what is, I think there is some discretion about what is a 24-month or longer resource dedicated to serving a qualifying utilities retail customers. And I noted WRA mentioned participation in markets require a 24-month commitment. I hadn't really thought about that and if that would qualify, But certainly that is something that should be explored. Even though it says 24 months power purchase agreement, maybe that qualifies as 24-month power purchase agreement. I'm really not sure. I hadn't thought about that. So I'll just throw that out. Other things less than 24 months is not going to qualify. And again, dedicated to serving retail customers. What does that mean? Does it mean that if the utility is using 10% of that for off-system sales, is it still dedicated to serving customers? Yes, absolutely. And one thing WRA called to my attention, which I would agree with, is if they sell off a portion of a unit, it is no longer dedicated to retail customers. So I assume that based on that definition, that could possibly be an exception. But then there's other things that we have to consider, which resources to count, what are dedicated to, and I'm trying to figure out what things go into that bucket. And one of them would be utilities purchase energy from distributed generation facilities. And my understanding is some customers are on net metering, they're self-serving. Other customers are having their energy that they don't consume purchased by the utility, and the RECs go along with it. And I don't know what their contracts look like. Are they for 2 years or longer? That's a question of fact. And are they dedicated to serving retail customers? Well, if the utility is taking all of that purchased energy and RECs and using it to satisfy the RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, I would say yes, that would qualify. So one of the things I think the commission will have to do is make a factual inquiry of all these different items and figure out how they fit in this picture. On the RECs, I think WRA made an important point that I don't know if PNM has any resources that are just energy that don't include the RECs for renewable power purchase agreements. I know SPS has had some of those in the past, and they just use the energy and don't necessarily procure or retire the RECs. So I would suggest that unless either PNM has procured and retired the RECs, or there's some way to ascertain that no other person has done that, for example, maybe it's a resource PNM owns. I mean, I don't know why that would happen, but we do need to ensure that anything that is claimed to be renewable and have that has zero emissions has got to be, it has to be ascertained whether directs or otherwise that is actually renewable energy and someone else hasn't claimed the RECs. As far as whether the RECs themselves are demonstration of that renewable energy, I'm not really sure on that point, how the commission needs to come down. But I would point out that when PNM retires RECs for its voluntary programs, for Facebook, the RPS, all of those are retired on behalf of PNM's customers. So there's no question in my mind that all of that energy from all the voluntary programs, the Greater Kudu and all of that does satisfy the requirement of renewable energy that would count towards, that would be part of the equation. All right, I'm talking a lot here. Any questions?
So you're saying it would?
It would.
In terms of this one particular Greater Kudu customer that has the direct wind power contract, you would see that as satisfying?
Yes, absolutely. So Greater Kudu, Facebook, whatever you want to call them, they have a number of PPAs that actually are system resources, and PNM retires the renewable energy certificates on behalf of that customer. But all of it is system energy dedicated to serving PNM's customers. Facebook is a PNM customer. The RECs are retired. So yes, that qualifies.
Yeah, thanks for that. And then frankly, since we're talking about RECs, I'll go ahead and ask this question, and I had same question, might actually be a better question for WRA, but I don't understand why we're talking about RECs here, because the law is about carbon emissions, not renewable energy. And then one of the benefits of renewable energy is no carbon emissions, but that's not what the law is measuring. So I don't appreciate or understand the value of complicating this rule with recs.
Thank you, Chairman, for that question. And this is an important distinction. So the RPS literally requires proof is demonstrated by retiring recs. And so I agree, retiring recs is not necessarily how you would demonstrate compliance. However, you do, in order to count a renewable PPA towards as a zero emission resource, you have to simply ensure somebody else isn't counting those recs. So if they've been sold off, it would allow someone else to emit, and then that resource is considered to be null energy. It's not considered to be renewable if the recs are not accompanying it. So you cannot split them and have someone else claiming the recs. So for compliance, I'm not suggesting you have to have X number of recs, but you just have to demonstrate if you're saying this is a zero carbon resource that it really is. And that might be demonstrated either by retiring the recs or otherwise demonstrating nobody else has retired those recs. It just goes to proving it should be counted as a zero carbon resource.
And Mr. Chair, this is Stacy telling you with Western Resource Advocates. I agree with Mr. In most states, the renewable energy credit is defined as including all environmental attributes. And so that would include the zero carbon attribute. And so if a utility is selling off that rec, they're also selling off the zero carbon attribute. And so I think that's why it is critical that the recs are retired annually by PNM on behalf of their customers in order to demonstrate that they have zero carbon energy that's serving their customers. And there's precedent in other states. I know at least the state of Colorado requires utilities to retire recs to meet their emission standard requirements. And those recs, again, are retired annually. There's a little bit of a lag time for recs that are created during the fourth quarter of the year, but otherwise generally in the year generated.
Yeah, thank you. And then just follow up to that, another thing that I didn't quite understand is the mismatch in time periods. So recs have to be retired for this law annually, but then for renewable compliance, they can be banked or borrowed in some instances under New Mexico precedent. So anyway, it's not a retirement for RPS that they be retired that year. Why is it a requirement for this law? And then again, requiring recs to be retired in a calendar year, but compliance is really a 3-year window, so allows banking and borrowing of zero carbon. But why wouldn't that also mean if recs are important, and won't say they are yet, why isn't that also bankable and borrowable within a 3-year period?
Are you asking WRA?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was asking WRA because that was one of their recommendations to us, and it just a time mismatch. First of all, still thinking through the complication of a rec versus you can observe whether something emitted carbon or not. And then if we are complicating with recs, how come that is limited to a calendar year where zero carbon isn't?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's a good question, and it raises a good point. I think I want to think about this a little bit more, but I actually think that retiring recs as part of that 3-year compliance period could be okay. So retiring those recs at the end of that 3-year compliance period, if that is the compliance period the commission ends up landing on. Alternatively, I don't know that it makes a huge difference if they're retired annually versus over a 3-year period or at the end of a 3-year period, because you're either counting all of those zero emission resources in each year of the period or in total at the end of the 3-year period. I guess I would want to understand what the implications are for RPS compliance, but candidly, particularly, as you're looking at a 200 pound per megawatt hour standard 10 years from now, I would assume that this emission rate standard is more stringent than the RPS, but I that would depend certainly on the mix of resources at play.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so far we've heard from WRA and Missouri. Do you want to say something or just want to be here, E&M, or do you have any observations or responses to what you have heard so far?
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Stacy Goodwin, Associate General Counsel at PNM. Steve Shrupke is in the audience with us also. He's our case manager. And on the line, I believe there's Tom Falgren and Nick Phillips, who's our Director of Resource Planning. So I'm going to leave technical answers and questions to Mr. Falgren and Mr. Phillips. I'm not sure if Kelsey Martinez is also on the line, but she may be available as well. Just generally, we did file our initial responses to the questions that were presented by the commission. We're happy to go over those. If you have any specific follow-up questions you may have, we'll do our best to answer them. I think we do need time to sort of evaluate the information that WRA has just put in front of you before responding to this. Just initially, I will say off the bat, I'm concerned that there's an unnecessary creation of conflicts with other portions of the Public Utility Act by trying to bring RECs into this rule as a means of demonstrating compliance. This is about emissions and emissions limitations. And I think how you measure emissions is very different from what you were doing with RECs and how RECs are used and retired to meet the RPS standard, especially when you have a banking ability. One of the goals of this rulemaking, I think, as you move forward to creating a draft rule, is to sort of look holistically at what this is doing, along with the other provisions of the Renewable Energy Act, as well as the rest of the ETA. And a concern certainly is making sure that you can account for variability that occurs from operational needs and economic needs, such as off-system sales and purchases, so that we give a lot of thought into how we do these calculations so that we're not setting this limitation, these rules and requirements to conflict with other goals of the commission and other purposes of activities of the utility, such as participation in the energy imbalance market and participation in day-ahead and regional markets, so that there's sort of a general benefit to customers, that while the emissions are quite important and reducing them is very important, it's clearly the statutory goal. I think there needs to be some balance with cost to customers that result from that. And so taking that into consideration as we move forward into a rulemaking, I think is very important. So I'll stop there, see if you have questions of me. And then also if you have any questions, you may want to follow up on what Ms. Zur or WRA said with Mr. Falgren or Mr. Phillips.
Yeah, thank you for that. Do you have any questions? Well, Commissioner Aguilar is winding up.
Well,
It's too soon. Not fast enough.
This is a very complicated issue, especially as you start to talk about participation in regional markets. And I'm still trying to think through how I want to ask my questions. But I think in terms of, yeah, I got sort of, in the rec conversation, in my mind, I was trying to think through how this would work in the participation of a regional market. I guess, could you give your perspective of that? You sort of already did. Maybe this is a question for others, but.
I think I'd like to give it some more thought than just, off the top of my head, because I haven't really thought about how this is working and how it may end up competing with what you're using Recs for and their purpose in the portfolio standard. Because I really do think you can create some conflict there. And that comes at a cost to customers. If you, for example, have a system here where you're saying, I have to use my Recs for this purpose, that may end up precluding the use of the banking system that has been a foundation of RPS compliance. And so I want to give that more thought. I think it's something that should be explored and, looked at with sort of a cautionary note by the commission. I think this really is about carbon emissions and those are measured. So I think if we are saying this is the amount of carbon emission associated with the energy used to serve customers in any given period of time, then that has its own built-in measurement standards. We report emissions to the Environment Department, so we have those measurements in place. We understand how that works. It may not make sense, practically speaking, to kind of mix and match your measurement tools and how you're using different certificates or other forms of reporting or compliance documentation to meet your standards in this rule. So I just want to have a cautionary note there. And I think it is obviously worth further discussion among all of the parties and interested stakeholders.
Thank you. Yeah, I do agree that it's going to merit its own discussion. At some point, I also want to ask just generally about, the markets that are emerging, and I don't know that this is the right time. So I'll hold.
Well, it might be, because I was just going to follow up on your questions with, I saw that this complicates participation in the EIM and in some of the info that came to us from PNM. And it was that was confusing to me, because one of the motivations for getting to a day-ahead market is how very little energy changes hands in the EIM. And then in the EIM, we have states whose actual emission limits to all of their utilities are more stringent than what we're looking at here. So how does the EIM not account for the idea that utilities have carbon limits to work for? So how could that be a barrier? And then the next question was, and this is where I think we're getting into the territory you were describing, is in these processes where people are trying to form a bigger, better market, day ahead, all the way up to maybe RTO someday, like the SPP offering, there's a very robust discussion going on about how to design that offering with emissions tracking for states like Washington, Oregon, who have more stringent standards than this. Is PNM participating in that to make sure that as that market forms, and if it becomes the offering that PNM joins, that the rules are compatible with this law and providing our customers the best deal? And then similarly, California, same conversation going on, expand to day-ahead in the framework of California, Washington, Oregon, these big states that are members of EIM, trying to make sure that happens in a way that they can comply with their state law. So anyway, when I rolling back to where I started, the first question was, when I saw complication with regional markets, it just looked like, that looks like a red herring.
I don't think it's a red herring, and I'll just say a couple things and then let maybe Mr. Falgren or someone else for PNM on the, who's participating by Zoom, jump in as well. I think it's not that it's necessarily complicating. I think you just have to account for how those systems work. And how, as you were talking about, what the requirements are within those systems. When we talk about network resource designations, that has specific meaning for FERC and, that we comply with. And so how you are talking about your generation and your portfolio and what it's producing in terms of emissions associated with meeting your native load, what is a network resource, those kinds of things I think just need to be discussed and accounted for as you're talking through the rule. And I'm going to stop for a moment and see if someone on the phone wants to jump in. I don't know if they're registered to participate. Let's see.
I am, so I don't know if you can hear me, Stacy or Mr. Commissioners. Are you able to? I think a lot of it will have to come down to the formula that ultimately the commission promulgates as the way we measure compliance. For example, if the formula does not change the denominator as off-system sales megawatt hours increase, it becomes more and more stringent the more off-system sales we make. And so if you move forward in a path like that, that could reduce our ability to participate effectively in the EIM or other markets. Similarly, if we're required to count every single hourly transaction that could be made either in a day ahead through the bilateral markets or through a future day ahead market, if those are counted, and again the off-system sales volumes in the denominator don't change or otherwise are accounted for properly in the overall formula, it will reduce PNM's ability to be able to provide benefits to customers through organized markets. So I think the market question comes down to, can we design a robust framework that allows us to measure all the carbon emissions in a way that can then be put into market offers, or as we design markets, the rules for the markets, to make sure that we can provide the value to the customers at the same time fully participating in the market. So it needs to be done in a kind of lockstep way, I would say. As far as a few of the other comments that are going on, I agree with Ms. Goodwin. We want to review WRA's comments as well. Off its face, I don't think that the recs have any bearing whatsoever on carbon intensity or carbon emission calculations, and certain things that have been put forward really need to be explored to ensure that they're not going to have adverse impacts on markets in particular. We've been able to pass along $76 million of benefits to our customers through EIM participation since we first joined. And if this formula or this compliance mechanism is designed in a way that's not flexible enough to allow us to continue to participate for the benefit of our customers in the EIM or other markets, those benefits will go away, but we'll still be paying for the additional costs of complying with all the other regulations, right? So we want to make sure that we balance everything out for our customers.
Thank you for that. I think another added complication with respect to the regional markets discussion is that the programs in Washington and California are price programs that are pricing emissions and changing the economic dispatch of resources. And so just want to ask whether you've been involved or following those discussions to see how by those discussions I mean the ones being had in for EDAM and Markets Plus.
We have been participating. I have not, so I am not the right person to really delve into that with you today. So my apologies for that, but Kelsey Martinez has spent a lot of time working on that. I think she's presented to you before. We're happy to follow up further with you in those discussions as this, as your workshops progress and you move towards the rulemaking. But yes, we have been actively participating in evaluating both potential regional markets for day ahead and what that might mean for the, the intra-hour markets as well that we participate in. So I think, one builds on the other. If you're in a day ahead, you need to also be in the intra-hour market as well for that system. So, and obviously we're looking very closely at those to move forward. We do think, I think a lot of this is making sure that those broader contexts are taken into account and we understand the implications of a rulemaking about when you're coming up with the formula of, what goes into your numerator and denominator for presenting compliance calculations, that we understand what that means when we're participating in these other markets as well, so that we can the goal is to properly measure the energy and the emissions associated with the energy that's serving customers. And that really is our goal. Certainly PNM is trying to achieve that, but we want to make sure it's not creating some unforeseen outcomes as we do it.
If I might just add on a little bit there, and I do apologize, Commissioner Ellison, I didn't mean to interrupt you. If you want to speak, please, I don't want to interrupt.
That's okay, go ahead.
What I was going to just add on is, and Kelsey is with us, I see in the participant list, we are exploring all the different things that Ms. Goodwin just spoke about. A couple of pieces I guess I would just point out is, yes, there could be mechanisms to augment the bid prices of different resources when offering those resources in the market to account for carbon. But that's only one piece of the equation that could reduce the amount of energy that we would sell into the market and thus reduce overall carbon emissions. But there also has to be the tracking component where, depending on what goes into that formula, we may not want to decrement the bid price of a unit. We just may want to remove the associated carbon emissions from the numerator and those off-system sales megawatt hours from the denominator to make sure that what we're actually using to serve our retail customers is accounted for. And at the same time, we're still able to fully participate in a market and provide those benefits to our customers. On the other hand, if we need to include every single piece of every transaction as potentially implicated by WRA, then we have to have a way of tracking every single piece of carbon emissions from every single 5-minute or hourly sale, which is a practical impossibility. Although I know that they're working to try to add those things to market designs, but those are the complexities that we need to keep in mind. And just offering up a price decrement to reduce the overall dispatch of certain resources, while it does reduce carbon, it will also economically disparage our customers from receiving certain benefits through the impact of markets.
Thank you. I did have a question for Ms. Goodwin. When I look at this statute, which part of it reads, the qualifying utilities, generation and sources of energy produced, procured pursuant to the power purchase agreements with a term of 24 months or longer and that are dedicated to serve the qualifying utilities retail customers. In your view, is that really getting at long-term transactions only and really attempting to not deal with short-term power purchases?
I think it probably is trying to do that. However, as these markets change and evolve, and you are trying to run your system in a way that accounts for your ability to both sell and purchase in the market, how your system is operating is tricky to go, but for the market, we would do this, or so that you are trying to, again, as Mr. Phillips alluded to, overly complicate how you're tracking what you're doing. So I do think, to me, a way of interpreting that section is to ensure that where you are procuring long-term sources of energy, that long-term purchase power agreements that are 2 years or longer. I think especially if you look at Commission Rule 551, you'll find that part of it is to say that those are a reasonable equivalent to a utility actually owning a resource. And so it's, I think, trying to acknowledge that you have purchase power agreements that are serving the same purpose as the owned generation. And so I think that's one way of trying to look at that language and incorporate its meaning into a practical rule.
And so one way of interpreting it might be that the intent is to really focus on the long-term transactions, and that say things like purchases from or sales to the energy imbalance market, or just short-term purchases or sales are really hard to account for, and we're gonna take them out of the equation, and we're only going to focus on the long-term resources.
I think that is a way of looking at it. I will note that you operate your resources as a fleet. I'm probably not the right person to talk about this since I am the attorney, but you do. I've been banned from doing math, so no, I am not doing any math here. You do have to recognize that sometimes you may operate your system and you dispatch it on an economic basis, but also accounting for operational needs. And so there are times when you might, if you said, the only thing we use to serve our customers are long-term PPAs and our own resources, I think it's not a reflection of reality. And so I think, again, this is back to looking at how can we reasonably take into account how systems function, how the utility operates its system, while coming up with a rule that is not impossible to administer, but does the job that's trying to be accomplished here. And so it is going to be a balance. I do think the commission is going to need to think about how to take these short-term resources into consideration, as well as the ones that are specifically identified in the statute. And it may mean that overly complicates it, but I think that it's just an issue that needs to be explored. And I think PNM had tried to come up with some illustrations of this can be a more restrictive or more holistic way of looking at things. As we move forward, coming up with scenarios where we can say, this is what it would look like. This is the answer would look different if you did this measurement versus that. That may be useful information to the commission.
Probably the day ahead, a potential day ahead market, may not have been in mind. Obviously, PNM's natural gas generation, if that's potentially being dispatched by some other entity, it would seem to complicate how you would comply with this.
It does. I mean, it's dispatched by PNM. I mean, we dispatch it on an economic basis. And so if we can make advantageous sales into the market for customers, 100% of the revenues from off-system sales are flowed through the fuel clause to, as part of our calculation of our fuel factor. And so I just think that does, you're correct though, Commissioner, that does change, that you may use on occasion your gas resources more than you otherwise might. Vice versa, you may, use more renewables that you can get on the in the market. So
I was mainly referring to if and when we have a day ahead market in the West,
sure.
And instead of PNM dispatching its own plants, you were to offer those resources to the day ahead market, and they would be dispatching those
So we would have,
resources in that case.
where P and M decides to commit a resource, I mean, again, we're back to what period of time are we measuring when you want to talk about how are we looking at all of this? And I just think these are a lot of questions, technical questions. I should stop, let the technical guys talk instead of me.
Okay, I'll ask something else. The question came up about the Facebook customer, which I think is interesting because they obviously have, such large power purchase agreements, and clearly for the purpose of RPS compliance, those power volumes do not count towards P&M's compliance with the RPS standard. So in your view, would it make sense to have a different paradigm here and say, they do count when we're thinking about greenhouse gas or CO2 emissions?
Well, I think you have to be I think it's a question of how you look at whether they count, quote unquote, or not. So to the extent a customer participates voluntarily in to acquire renewable resources through their own additional actions, although, the PPAs that do serve the data center are PPAs between the utility and the power producer, and the energy goes into the system for uses of the system as a whole. There is accounting through the special services agreement to ensure that Facebook is bearing the cost of, or Meta is bearing the cost of those contracts, because it has a benefit to them to do so, which is to be supplied 100% from renewables. So if a customer does not participate in a voluntary program, their retail sales count towards our RPS calculation and percentages. To the extent there is renewable energy being supplied to them through another means, through a voluntary means, then that just reduces the number of sales that we then have to also meet additional percentages for. So it is accounted for, I think, in the RPS percentage calculations in a way that works differently from what the purpose of this statute is. I do think it's back to, what are we trying to do here? It is having a portfolio that serves customers, and that the emissions associated with the portfolio and how customers are served meet certain standards. And so I think that's, again, that they are trying to accomplish something different from each other. And I want to just be careful about trying to line them up when it doesn't appear that the statutes were intended to be aligned that specifically.
Stacy, could I add something quick?
This is Tom Falgren.
Please go ahead.
I think it's important to maybe look at the aspect of what FERC requires us to do is designate network resources. And what we designate as network resources are those utility owned that are serving retail customers and PPAs greater than 24 months. And those are the resources that we designate for meeting retail customer needs. And so I think, to me, that's why the language was written in the statute that way, which is designated for retail customers. It really aligns, I think, very predominantly with what we have a very official, formal process for designating network resources. I think the complication when you get to the market, and you're very correct, is the market is always a price driven market. It's not a compliance driven market. It's a price driven market. So you have to try to overlay some price override to drive a compliance. But I think you also have to look at what's the controllability of this particular standard, right? This is not something you're going to turn on a dime and change this average in a day or a week or a month or probably even a year. It's something that's more of a long-term decision. We're all going to have to get together and we're going to have to decide what resources P&M adds in order to average this number down. So it's going to require, some long-term planning, some long-term commitment. And there are a tremendous amount of adjustments, near-term adjustments, load projections, performance of resources that can affect this dramatically, if you would. So I see it more as intended as a long-term driver, where again, the market, and while you may have to participate in a regional market for many years, resources in any market, even a full RTO, are almost typically only prescribed in an instantaneous or a day ahead basis. And so it's hard to kind of interpret or even plan for how that would be measured, I guess. So I would try to draw us back to the FERC definition of designated resources. So sorry for the interruption.
Yep. Okay, since I have a lawyer question for you then. Yeah, no, I mean, the questions that we asked, one of the things that I've heard in other contexts and I think is important for this is just the question of when the legislature passes a law, can the commission actually enforce it? So the last two questions, recourse and IRP, I was trying to kind of bookmark, goalpost ideas around enforcement. So this has worked very well because the whole point of this was to get diversity of ideas on the table before we do NOPR. So then hopefully we'll write a good draft rule, especially because this one we're writing from whole cloth, right? It's not like a revision of the district. But I was really kind of interested in the response on 7, notice of material change, because what I saw was P&M issued 2020 IRP, said action plan will result in complying with this law. And then real things happened, events occurred. But the result of those events was the result of the action plan means P&M can no longer comply with the law. So to me, inability to comply with the law is material. So why I took from P&M's response that, hey, we don't need to do that. And just trying to learn from more, how is inability to comply with the law not a material event? It's the way I was looking at it.
Yeah, and I will say, I don't think this was the best answer to I think we could have taken a little more care with this. There are some other things. I mean, we are in another IRP process. Mr. O'Donnell had pointed out that it is, P&M can come in with a filing that meets the IRP, that is in the IRP rule or in that docket that says this is a material change, and we can do that. We're not trying to resist doing something like that.
Yeah, I mean, just the rule says promptly notify, so don't wait for the next IRP is what that means to me.
And I think also, I mean, there is another issue about sort of when we're starting all of this in terms of when the rule is implemented, when the statute becomes implemented. In the past, where it has not been feasible to implement a statute on a date necessarily set by the legislature, the court has found that the commission does have some discretion in making a determination about when implementation begins. And so that is, one thing to take into consideration. But certainly with regard to this, I think we can move forward on that kind of clarification with regard to what we've got in the IRP. I think you're correct that there have been a lot of shifts that we've been reporting to the commission on, and when new resources have been coming online, especially the ones that are the long-term PPAs.
Yeah, I guess what the impact it had on me was it made me question if P&M thinks inability to comply with the law is immaterial.
No, I don't think that's an immaterial question. And
Okay.
that was not the intent of if the answer came across that way, that was certainly not our intent.
Because, the law says beginning of this year, we're behind in implementing the rule. I agree with Mr. O'Donnell that P&M should be commended for coming forward and saying, gee, we've got this thing, we need a rule. So anyway, it was just kind of stuck out like a sore thumb the way I was thinking we were proceeding, and then it looked like I couldn't figure out what was immaterial. And so my assumption was, again, to just look at page 1 of executive summary, you got a law starting in 2023 and you're going to meet it. Now, suddenly you're not.
Yeah. So our intent was not to consider that to be, to say a change of law and our ability to comply with it. I mean, we're not trying to imply that that's an immaterial matter. I think it's just something that we hadn't given enough consideration to.
Okay, and I just wanted to have this conversation so you understand why I was asking the question, because when we got the answer back, it's like, is this the whole answer?
No, and my apologies if you think that it was an incomplete or not, inarticulate answer. That wasn't our intent.
Okay, thank you. Because I mean, just big picture, if the easy stuff isn't even going to happen, then what about the hard stuff?
Exactly.
In the world of how do we enforce these rules and the law, and as Mr. argued, a constitutional requirement. So,
and I do think, one of the best things in a rule is for it to be a practical how-to. That is one that isn't overly complex in the requirements to comply, because that makes it overly complex in trying to determine when there is compliance or non-compliance. And so I think the balance of how do you come up with your calculations, your formulas, I think coming up with one that seems practical makes a lot of sense. And so just to keep that in mind as well.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I guess the question of, is this instantaneous or an average requirement, I think is interesting. On the one hand, the statute is very clear that compliance shall be measured and verified every 3 years. On the other hand, it is prescribing an exact amount by January 1st, 2023. So does it mean that we're not going to know what level was achieved on January 1st, 2023 until 3 years later, when we were able to verify and look at the numbers for the whole 3-year period?
I think the statute is not the clearest when it says start by, that there is a by 2023, but your compliance periods don't start until 20, that if the issue is what is the benchmark of that date, that you could know that. But I think it's different from trying to say that the period before then is somehow one that is used for compliance purposes. So I think I would just be cautious about trying to go back in time in terms of, setting the standard, setting your compliance periods. I think there's a little bit of contradiction in the language of the statute on that point.
Stacy, could we just maybe enter a practical way of maybe management of this? Would, if you're okay with that. Sorry to interrupt again. Tom Falgren again.
Tom, you broke up at the beginning.
And I'll just. Oh. Yeah.
A little louder,
maybe
please.
just jump to. Sure, maybe just jump to an idea on the practical implementation of this, if you would. And again, I realize this is a standalone law, but in some ways it's a supplement to the RPS, right? We're all heading in the same direction. We're all heading to carbon free. This is another component of that to make sure we continue to move in that direction. So one suggestion might be, do we expand out the RPS filing on an annual basis, which we have to file every June 1st. And then on June 1st, we would report, how we have in the previous year, and then how we're planning on, basically it's more like the RPS, which is here's the plan for compliance moving forward. That provides a regulatory structure for folks that disagree with that approach. They can do discovery, they can do intervention. There's a hearing, there's a testimony associated with it. But it allows us to have a process where we're not recreating another process, but essentially and again, there is why I would agree, there is nothing in the rule that talks about RECs. There is obviously some coordination between the renewable portfolio standard and the carbon emission standard. So that may just be a consideration to think about from a practical standpoint as we start talking about how to measure and how to report, if you would.
I appreciate that very practical suggestion, but it's crashing up against Mr. Phillips' comment about how this has nothing to do with RECs and renewable energy. And it's hard to mingle two things in one case. Is just kind of my experience with that. But yeah, no, that's a good idea. Because, like you say, if annual reporting is required, then it just gets really hard to reconcile that with P&M's comment about firewall between RECs and this rule. But
Yeah,
no, I appreciate that, and I don't want to discredit that at all. What Nick said, because I agree with that 100%. But again, what's going to have to happen is we look to continue to lower this. Is P&M is going to have to ask the commission for a different set of resources. And so, how are we going to ask the commission? In what setting are we going to ask the commission for a different set of resources as we continue to move this down? Right? It's nothing P&M can control unilaterally. We cannot control this unilaterally. We have to ask permission to add different set of resources. And so you have to look at that in the context. And so in that context, it does have some overlap with maybe an RPS addition if you're looking at additional renewables in that context. And again, nope, the requirements are separate. We don't want to commingle them. But again, when you're talking about those kind of big ideas about how we're moving forward with the resources, it may make sense. But I appreciate your comment. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, this has been illuminating for me. I mean, I do think to some, obviously they are related. At some point, we might be conflating capacity with energy. But I'm also trying to consider the comments that were made about resource shuffling and to some extent leakage. I mean, I do see these, as written as being about retail load in New Mexico. And so I want to ask, and I'm not sure exactly who to ask, maybe whoever wants to answer from, not just P&M. Having not had the benefit of, these discussions, right, because I just, came back to New Mexico in January. Was there a discussion about resource shuffling or leakage in designing these laws? I guess we're talking about the Energy Transition Act, but I'm also, thinking about the RPS, the Renewable Energy Act.
This will strain my memory. I don't recall there really being that kind of discussion. I could be wrong. I'm not trying to speak for everybody else. I do think that we've seen a lot of changes since the legislation was first contemplated and enacted in 2019. Yeah, I mean, quite a bit has changed that I don't think was necessarily taken into consideration or thought about one way or the other when the law was drafted. But I know others were also involved in that participation, and so I'll let anyone else speak up on that point as well.
Commissioners, this is Stacy Tellinghusen with Western Resource Advocates. I think this is a really good question. I was not personally involved with the legislation, but my colleagues were, and those same colleagues and I and some of the folks in this room, I know were involved in a proceeding before this commission in 2017 and 2018 around a clean energy standard, which had some similar goals. There's some experience, I think, from that proceeding that we could draw on here. But I think my sense is that the goal should be to do what we can to avoid any resource shuffling. So making sure that whatever emissions and generation are accounted for in this rulemaking or accounted for in this reporting requirement, are clear enough that we don't have resources being shuffled, so that, again, the most carbon intensive resources are not being assigned to serving market purchases or to serving off-system sales. If the commission decides to just apply this to retail sales, I think if the commission decides to apply this to all generation and sales from the set of sources that that PNM has rate recovery for, then I think that it's a slightly different question. So to me, the fundamental question is is the commission looking just at the emissions associated with retail sales, in which case I think we have to be really careful about resource shuffling, or is the commission looking at all of the sources that PNM owns or is getting rate recovery for? If that is clear.
And just to be clear, and this is not meant to be argumentative at all. All of the purchases, whether they're long-term, short-term, intra-hour, or owned, or generation that's owned, we do receive recovery of whether it's a purchase or not, but all purchases we do receive recovery of. So I want to make sure that we're careful about this. Let's not use purchase as a standard necessarily. I mean, so, but I do agree with Stacy's point that that we need to understand what resources we're talking about and how they're accounted for, and that you're not willy-nilly shuffling around and changing how it's working. So I think a holistic view is very important. I agree in principle that we're not trying to shove resources into one category versus another in order to game the system now.
I'm sorry, do you mind if I interject really quick? And Ms. Goodwin, thanks, and WRA, thanks. We agree with you that we wouldn't want to, try to game the numbers. The first fundamental question is, what's the formula we're going to use? And if we do use a formula that's going to, let's call it bifurcate emissions associated with off-system sales from those used to actually serve native load, there are examples throughout the industry that we can go look at. We don't need to design something from the ground up. There's many examples throughout industry. For example, if you wanted to think about a very similar procedure for setting, base rates that would have a native load fuel cost versus, how you would allocate off-system sales margins. There's examples of how that's done around the country. And so, it's an ex post analysis, but part of the idea would be is if we're going to agree that we should separate retail emissions from off-system sales emissions, we should also agree on the way we will do that calculation as a part of this workshop or part of this rulemaking.
That makes sense.
And I think that clean energy standard Ms. Tillinghuisen was talking about was in line with what Mr. Phillips just said, was use the fuel clause maybe as a way to guide what's being dedicated to customer service. So another thing to think about. Okay, any other questions? Anybody else have questions for each other? Because again, like I say, this, from my point of view, very much value all the participation here. Goal was diversity of ideas before we launch into a NOBR. And that's happening. So want to keep that happening as long as we're all here together. Ms. Zer, did you have something?
Yeah, I just following up on what Stacey.
It'd be helpful if you had a microphone so people in online land can hear you.
I'm just.
And we got microphones all over the room.
All right, how's that?
Yep, good. Thank you.
Following up on what Stacy said about the resources being the long-term ones, basically meaning P&M's major resources, just looking again at the word dedicated to serving qualified retail customers, that could, one of the things the commission will have to do is come up with a definition. What does that mean? One way you could look at it would be real simple to administer CCNs. If there's a CCN, that is a resource dedicated to customers. And the same thing, the thing about 2-year purchase power agreements, at least under the rule when this was enacted, I haven't looked at it recently. That is the thing about 2-year purchase power agreements is they're approved by the commission. And so we're talking about major resources approved by the commission are the ones that commission's regulating. And it kind of does away with having to look at all these other smaller transactions and everything else, with the theory that if you're regulating the utilities' major resources, when they're trading into these markets, they're offering a cleaner fleet. And that in itself is a benefit. So we don't need to worry about all this other stuff. Because the legislature didn't. Maybe the legislature determined it would be very difficult to manage and come up with emissions rates, as I think Mr. Phillips said, for transactions that are going back and forth every day. And it says 2-year purchase power agreements. So that would certainly simplify things. That was my comment.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then going around the room, we got some folks who, like Ms. Burns, do you want to say something? Or?
No.
Okay. And we also have utility division staff, Mr. Rokoff.
Good afternoon, commissioners. Before I go, I should check with Gloria Regensburg. I got the memo, and she was going to make any comments first on this hearing. Gloria, are you on Zoom land?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. I'll turn on my camera. I don't have any comments right now. It's been a good discussion, though. Thank you for asking.
Okay, thanks, Gloria. Yeah, this isn't in staff's testimony, but as I was hearing the comments, and I guess this is the forum to talk about it, but off-system sales result in a huge amount of money. Like we're looking, I think Nick said $76 million so far. And staff believes this needs to be reviewed and determine, how we balance the related CO2 emissions and how they get included in the calculation. And we really need to balance that rate impact, that rate reduction impact with the amount of emissions, because we don't get a lot of opportunities to reduce rates.
And it's getting more complicated because it's now nested within regional markets. So that's another issue, but I think we really need to be pragmatic and try to figure out how to capture those savings. And if prices are $500 a megawatt hour in California, I think we want PNM to capture those savings for our ratepayers, and I think it is through the fuel clause right now. But I was just thinking maybe an example, and I hate to bring RECs back into the picture, but maybe part of that savings can be used to purchase RECs on those off-system sales volumes. And I just thought I would maybe throw that out there as an idea, but again, those off-system sales are pretty significant, so I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Mr. O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, commissioners, and all the participants. I really appreciate the conversation today. I'm putting on my policy director hat and just going to express a couple of things that I thought about the conversation today. I'm mixed on several of the big topics that have been discussed and a little concerned that we didn't talk about other things. One is that the commission should encourage the full use of renewable energy and the RECs, which argues for ensuring that the utilities retire the RECs that are associated with the generation. In reality, though, we're talking about the carbon footprint inside the state of New Mexico. That's what the legislature had in mind when they crafted this. And they didn't take into consideration a lot of the things we're talking about, like regional markets. So first of all, with the RECs, even if you have a solar plant and it sells off its RECs, that doesn't increase the emissions from that plant, right? It doesn't change its footprint. It just changes the accounting when we're accounting. And going back to my days as executive director of the Green E program, our position would have been at that time is that even if it comes from a renewable energy source and the RECs are sold off, you have to account it at the system average. Call it 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour. That's kind of what the system average is. I don't know how the commission is going to come out on this. I think that it unnecessarily complicates the issue. I think that it can be alleviated, if not eliminated, by allowing banking, as you described, because it gives the utility more time to use the RECs in association with energy generated. So I don't have a clear answer on that, but that's my thinking about it. With regard to regional markets, I just don't think that they should be accounted for at all in this. I mean, that's not in the formula that the legislature put out. Clearly, they didn't understand day-ahead markets or 5-minute markets or whatever. They talked about PPAs, I think, alluding to the FERC rule. And so it doesn't fit into this calculation. And so we should set aside any conversation about the impacts on regional transactions that are less than 24 months, right? And every one of those transactions is either instantaneous or day ahead. So they just don't fit into the factor. The third is the special service contracts. I believe that they should be included because they represent both a match of the numerator and the denominator, because these special service contracts, at least in our circumstance, are for 100% renewable energy and the RECs that are associated with it. I think that that's to the advantage of the utility in calculating its overall emissions rate. But if you take it out, it skews the analysis by too much, right? Because I think that it really should be included in there. And then finally, I will endorse adding the reporting to the RPS reports, just perhaps as an addendum, or timing them with them so that we can look at it all the same. I don't see the interaction between exactly meeting the RPS and this. It is a different critter, but it at least gets the utility to report to us in a timely way on these two very important issues. So those are the thoughts that I had, and you'll probably hear me elucidate those when we have private conversations.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. And just for full transparency, the team within the commission that's been working on this so far includes Mr. O'Donnell, Maclee Kirol, and Robert Lundeen. So that's kind of the core of it. And that's frankly who I'm going to ask to take the next step in drafting a NOPR. So I really appreciate you summarizing the whole afternoon with your comments there, and you're highlighting some interesting things to think about and interesting choices. And so thanks for that. So I'm going to propose moving on to the next item on the agenda, unless I'm leaving somebody out that. And then I also want to point out, this ain't your last word. You know, like I've described, we're going to move into a more formal process than this as the next step. But so anyway, just going once, going twice, and then I will turn it over to my fellow commissioners just for any observations or closing remarks. Commissioner Aguilera first.
Sure. Observations, I mean, like I said, this has been not just informative, but illuminating. We have some difficult issues to, tackle going forward. I remain interested to hear your perspectives further in writing, if we don't have another workshop, about how we align the Energy Transition Act and our renewable portfolio standards. I mean, I think both of these are clearly talking about our retail customers, so focused on the load here in New Mexico. At the same time, I do appreciate the comments about leakage and resource shuffling, because I can see how it's a way to look like we're doing, what the law is telling us without fully accomplishing it. So, I remain interested in hearing your all thoughts about it. I do think that we're generally talking about capacity when we're looking at Section 10D. We're talking about long-term purchases, and in the RPS standard, I think we're talking about energy, what we're actually consuming. And this, like with everything else, I want to hear what you all have to say about that. I'll continue doing my research on that as well. So to close, I just want to thank everybody for sharing their thoughts, and also for the work that we will do in the future to solve this. So thank you.
Commissioner Ellison, do you have anything?
Sure. This has been helpful to me to hear everyone's thoughts and to delve into some of the nuances of this. It's a more complicated question than I had first anticipated. I like, just my rough take on this is I like the simplicity of the of focusing on the long-term resources and long-term contracts, and that seems to be what is contemplated in the statute here. At the same time, I'm not sure that matches well with the concern of some of the parties on the resource leakage and the potential concerns about somehow gaming the system by selling renewable power. I'm not sure that is very likely, but I guess my point is that if we're going to focus on the longer term resources, then it seems like we would have to somehow subtract out the short term purchases. And if we do that, I'm not sure we're going to address these concerns about leakage. So I guess, those are some of my initial thoughts about this, but I do appreciate everyone's participation today, and think this was a very useful workshop.
Okay, thank you. And I just wanted to close this by first again just reinforcing or reiterating some things have already been said. First, PNM should be commended for reaching out to the PRC for guidance on this rule. The law says the compliance started January 1st, 2023. So we are working to catch up, as Ms. Zur stated. And the other point of that is this is really big picture about implementing the Energy Transition Act. So I think that's important. I think the thoughtfulness and participation shows other people see that's important too. So that's another benefit of us gathering today. And so thanks to everyone for that. And then next steps, I told you that the team that's been working on this internally, Mr. O'Donnell, Mr. Lundeen, Mr. Kiro, I'll sit with them and we'll start drafting up a NOPR. And then I think the next step on that would be take the draft to an open meeting so I can get the viewpoints of my fellow commissioners, and then we might want another workshop after that, because as you both have observed, there are many Pandoras in the box here. So do we want to do another workshop to explore that, or just roll it out as a rulemaking and follow up with comments? And then again, I'm very appreciative that everybody participated. Also want to point out that when we do get into the NOPR process, deadlines are going to matter. So leave it with that. So with that, again, say thank you one more time. And any objection to adjournment?
Well, I did want to. Did you want to have a discussion about the process, like about whether we should have another workshop? I couldn't tell if you were asking to have another workshop before a NOPR, or.
My thought is let this internal team thrash it out a bit. And then if we just get stuck, we'll have another workshop.
Okay.
If we have a draft that can reasonably be presented to the commission, that will be the next step. And a potential step after the three of us meet to discuss is we need another workshop. So I'm not foreclosing future workshops here. There's two moments where they might happen. And then I know there is a lot going on here. So that's part of the other thing, is threading through everything else that's going on with sense of urgency, because we should have had this in place January 1st.
Yeah.
So that's the dramatic tension going on there on schedule.
Okay. I think it might be helpful. I don't know if others might, think it's helpful, but to at minimum give another opportunity to file additional comments to inform you know, having had the benefit of this discussion here. And I don't necessarily need that before we issue an over, but it might help us craft a NOPR that is, you know, closer to reflecting and considering everybody's comments.
No, that's, I think, an excellent suggestion. I mean, certainly we won't, this internal group, we don't have access to Mr. Lundin this week anyway, so I would say, and then there's no way we would get it to the commission by the meeting on the 19th.
Right.
That's just not possible. So invite, you know, this is like, as you have seen, super informal at this moment. If you did hear something or you've thought more about what you've already said, absolutely more comments are welcome. So go ahead and send those in. And my promise to you is we will look at them and think about them no matter what. And if your comment is we need another workshop, I would ask that you also propose agenda for workshop, because I thought being open and the hippie approach to a workshop would be great, but I wish I had provided more structure ahead of today, even though we got, I think, at least mostly to the result we could have gotten to. So anyway, long story short, your comments are always welcome. We're in a window now where if you think of something, send it in and we'll consider it before we take the next step.
Is there a date by which you would like to get that? Because I know Gannon would like to offer a few supplemental comments just based on what we've heard today.
I can guarantee that if you send it before October 19th, we'll have an opportunity for it to show up in any paperwork that we produce.
Thank you.
Yep.
If you submit it after, we'll talk about it. But if you want to affect the words that go on the paper before October 19th.
We appreciate that.
So yet another idea would be, once we have that draft proposed rulemaking, we could have another informal workshop to discuss that before we move into the formal NOPR process. That might help us refine it a bit more before we sort of get locked into a particular draft, but just a thought.
Yeah, excellent thought. And I also welcome you telling us pump the brakes, we need another workshop. So it's funny, I'm balancing that against, you know, commissioner training on economics. So what you said made me think of transaction costs. So how many workshops? But anyway, that's an aside. But yeah, good idea. Thank you. Just sanity check with Mr. O'Donnell and Mr. T-Roll, and my writing checks your body can't cash here.
Sound like a plan.
Do you think that can work? Okay. October 19th.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we're adjourned.